Work without pay, environments of physical, mental, and emotional abuse, dictated by corrupt, unjust overseers who on occasions were proven to have given more food to the dogs than to human beings. An environment dictated by punishment, where the person is stuck for the rest of their lives with no hope of escape. What does this describe?
19th century slavery?
Of the 30 people interviewed, 21 people responded with the same answer. In fact, these are the conditions of the 21st century American jail system.
4% of prisoners reported being sexually victimized in the past year.
You're seeing the underclass hunted through a war on dangerous drugs, allegedly, that is in fact merely a war on the poor, and has turned us into the most incarcerated state in the history of mankind.
Our nation now has the greatest number of prisoners of any country in the world. Nearly 1 in every 100 adults in America is in prison or jail.
The idea of prison originates from English workhouses, which were first built in the 1500s to provide work for vagrants and vagabonds, or the idle homeless. During the 1600s and 1700s, workhouses were experimented with to put petty criminals to work. By this point, when a criminal was convicted, they went to the workhouse or were sent to the American colonies. In the colonies, public whippings and stockades were standard punishment. Jails were used as short-term holding cells, not long-term punishment. After the Revolution, Anglophobic policymakers changed the criminal code to distance American punishment practices from their English legal roots. Fines, incarceration, or the death penalty became the options available to state governments. In the 1820s, penitentiaries became the primary mode of imprisonment to remove deviants from environments of corruption. Beginning around 1900, juvenile systems were introduced, based on a similar principle. During the Great Depression, the number of inmates increased dramatically. When World War II arrived, the number of inmates decreased. Then, in the Civil Rights era, President Nixon invoked a policy of law and order, refilling the prisons with protesters. In the 1970s, a stagnating economy again caused rises in prison population. In 1973, mandatory minimum sentencing was introduced, based on the theory that it would keep criminals off the streets and reduce crime. Emphasis was not on rehabilitation. Many people disagree with these regulations, as they have been shown to disproportionately target minorities. Additionally, many of these minimum sentences are still being served, even though the laws have changed.
My name is Kevin Hott. My number is 203093. I'm in here for trafficking methamphetamine. I start my 14th year in just a couple of months, and I will be here until I die. Yeah. I have life without parole for 3 ounces of methamphetamine.
Mandatory minimums didn't just not work, they ruined lives. Take the case of Weldon Angelos, a non-violent first-time offender. When he was 24, he sold small amounts of marijuana to an informant, while he happened to have a gun in his possession. And as a result, he received a 55-year mandatory minimum sentence with no parole.
If he had been an aircraft hijacker, he would have gotten 24 years in prison. If he'd been a terrorist, he would have gotten 20 years in prison. If he was a child rapist, he would have gotten 11 years in prison. And now I'm supposed to give him a 55-year sentence? I mean, that's just not right.
And the judge is right. This low-level pot dealer received the same sentence as someone who was an airplane hijacker, a child raper, and a terrorist all in one. All he did was sell small amounts of marijuana, which is now legal in some states. How is our jail system able to rehabilitate our population if all it does is force them to live in solitary confinement? The 90s also saw the introduction of privatized prisons. By 2000, 100 private prisons were built. The stock price of the Corrections Corporation of America tripled. A 2016 report by the U.S. Department of Justice asserts that privately operated federal facilities are less safe, less secure, and more punitive than other federal prisons. Having said that, private prisons were created in good faith. They enable government to cut costs. By allowing private prisons to take over the care of prisoners, the government does not have to spend money maintaining the prisons and the prison's workforce. Additionally, many citizens report being happier knowing that their hard-earned tax dollars are not funding an inmate's care. Some also argue that by giving prisoners over to the private prisons, federally run public prisons will become less overpopulated, providing those inmates with better living conditions overall. However, over the years, privatization of prisons has become more corrupt and have taken advantage of the system.
Records show 65 instances where Aramark employees failed to provide food or ran out.
The private vendor Aramark changed recipes to include cheaper, sometimes substandard ingredients.
Aramark Correctional Services made headlines recently after maggots were found in food served at prisons here in Michigan.
Medical spending in prisons dropped by $30 million, and staffing levels plummeted. 50 people died in Arizona Department of Corrections custody in just the first 8 months of this year. Compare that to 37 deaths in the previous 2 years combined.
Since the private prisons have a set amount of money coming in for each prisoner, they purposely spend less money, allowing for them to make a profit. This makes for poor living conditions and poor nutrition for prisoners in private sectors. While prisoners suffer from the unfair system of incarceration seen in the United States, many private businesses benefit. Incarcerated workers have been involved with mining, agriculture, and all manners of manufacturing, from making military weapons to sewing garments for Victoria's Secret. Among the highly recognizable brands that benefit from prison labor are IBM, Boeing, Motorola, Microsoft, AT&T, Dell, Nordstrom's, Revlon, Target, and Macy's. These businesses experience an economic boom at the cost of the prisoners' unfair wages. Inmates in private prisons receive an average of $2 per hour of prison work, well below the federal minimum wage. Unfortunately, prison labor is only going to expand. According to a recent census, there are over 2.26 million adults in U.S. federal and state prisons and county jails. Many experts believe that this cheap workforce will be further exploited in the future, particularly as the United States consistently has the highest incarceration rate in the world. America's growing incarceration rate began with Reagan's implementation of the war on drugs in the 1980s. This approach caused incarceration rates to skyrocket in the 1990s and has continued to grow today. The war on drugs lays as the backbone for mandatory minimums and the high population of prisoners. According to a 2015 Bureau of Prisoners report, 48.6% of federal prisoners are incarcerated for drug-related offenses. A psychology study tested the effectiveness of our war on drugs approach.
Professor Bruce Alexander thought it was obvious that lonely rats in boring cages would choose drugs over water. So he put them in a rat park, a lush cage with friends and everything a rat could want, while still having free access to drugs. Surprisingly, his rats chose not to use the drugs. The researcher even took the study one step further and had the rats use drugs for 57 days in the lonely cage until they became heavily addicted, and then placed them in the rat park. Astonishingly, the rats gradually reduced their drug use until they stopped using them altogether and lived the rest of their lives drug-free. The rat park experiments didn't show that chemical addictions don't exist, but it showed that they are not the only thing that matters in drug abuse. Maybe a person's access to a functioning social life and a lush cage are even more important than continuing the war on drugs mission of making drugs unavailable and penalizing the users.
These results question the effectiveness of our entire incarceration system. We fail to evaluate the environmental factors that lead to crime and drugs. The situationalism belief, meaning accepting the environmental factor, motivates healing rather than war. Rather than implementing all of these ineffective, inhumane punishments after the fact, we should focus on healing the environment and providing needed therapy, like the rats in the group cage, rather than locking people away in privatized prisons with unnecessarily long mandatory minimums.